it's said that politics makes strange bedfellows. And so we are very fortunate today to be in bed, as it were, with two very accomplished people with perspectives that are on different parts of the spectrum on corporate political activity. To my far right is Bruce Freed, who's known to many of us. He's the president and founder of the Center for Political Accountability, and he has over 30 years of experience in politics and public affairs and journalism. To my immediate right is Bruce Cartwright.
Brian.
I'm sorry, Brian Cartwright. We won't confuse you soon. Brian is a senior advisor at Potomac Capital Global Partners. He was a long-time partner at Latham & Watkins, where he was the chair of the public company practice group. And from 2006 to 2009, he was the GC at the SEC. So we're going to start with giving a bit of an overview of the debate on corporate political activity and try to identify those things that our panelists think are the most important parts of that debate for corporate secretaries to take away. We'll also talk about trends in this area and what we think the likely outlook will be in this area. And then if we have some time, we'll do a lightning round, which would be a quick pros and cons on a lot of the more contentious issues in this area. And we'll try to finish with some Q&A. So let's start with Bruce. And so Bruce, could you help frame the debate for us, and what should corporate secretaries be taking away from that?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I want to thank Matt for organizing the panel, and then Ken Birch of the Society for inviting me to speak to you about one of the most critical issues that are facing companies today, political disclosure. First of all, I would like to acknowledge those of you in the audience, with whom we've been working, and we've worked closely with them, and I want to express my appreciation for our ability to work together. That's been very important in developing practical approaches to disclosure and oversight of corporate political spending. We've worked with a variety of companies, Microsoft, Merck, Pfizer, Wells Fargo, Exelon, and others, and those have been very helpful in terms of developing very hands-on, practical ways for companies to engage in serious and meaningful disclosure. What I'd like to do is have us talk this morning in very practical, hands-on terms about what is becoming a mainstream corporate practice. Once we get into the discussion, I'm going to be very interested in your experiences and thoughts that you may have. We at the Center for Political Accountability value input from companies. It has been very helpful for us and has been reflected in the design and refinement of the CPA-Zicklin Index on corporate political accountability and disclosure, and in the policies that we have been working with companies to adopt to have meaningful disclosure and board oversight. Let me turn to the topics that Matt has set out, because they do provide a good framework. The first one is, what are the different types of political spending, direct and indirect? Political spending involves the use of money to influence the outcome of elections. Companies know when they're spending money to influence elections. The Center's Model Political Disclosure Resolution calls on companies to disclose political spending made with corporate funds. This does not include spending by the company's political action committee. Now, what does spending include? It includes direct contributions to candidates where allowed by law. That's in about half of the states. It includes company contributions to 527 organizations, spending on electioneering communications, independent expenditures, ballot initiatives, payments to trade associations and other tax-exempt organizations such as 501c4s that are used for political purposes. If you look at the Center for Political Accountability website, which is at www.politicalaccountability.net, there's a one-pager that we have posted that lays out meaningful disclosure and covers all of these. And again, it's in one page, so it's very easy to use. CPA also works with companies to adopt board oversight of their political spending and policies for decision-making. That's very important in terms of achieving accountability within the company. Now, why has political disclosure become such an important issue for both companies and shareholders? I think it can be summed up in one word: risk. Over the past several years, shareholders and companies have come to recognize that political spending using corporate treasury funds poses a range of risks. Those risks are reputation, business, and legal. A serious problem exists today with the rise of the 501c4 groups. That's where you have a real threat of extortion and shakedown because those groups, the 501c4s, do not disclose their donors. They are really vehicles or conduits for secret political spending. CPA has done several surveys through Mason-Dixon polling and research of shareholders and directors. We have found through those surveys that there's overwhelming concern about risk and strong support for disclosure and board oversight by both directors and retail shareholders. What is interesting today is that political disclosure is becoming a mainstream corporate practice as companies in ever-growing numbers are adopting disclosure and accountability policies. Let me run through some numbers that I think will really tell the story and show you what I mean. They really do provide a foundation for that. As of today, 118 companies, these are large companies, all within the S&P 500 and over half within the S&P 100, over half of the S&P 100 companies have reached disclosure agreements with CPA and its partners. The Center has been benchmarking companies for the past 3 years in the CPA-Zicklin Index, and a striking finding has been that companies have been adopting or strengthening disclosure and accountability policies during this period. The index gives us a chance to track that. We see this in the 88 companies that overlapped in the 2011 and 2012 indexes. 72% boosted their score on spending disclosure practices between 2011 and 2012. And 67% of the companies raised their score for board oversight of political spending. We recently completed a quick and broad snapshot of how companies in the S&P 500 have approached political disclosure and accountability. And the findings really are quite revealing. They were a very significant surprise to us. Let me run through them. A third of the companies have detailed policies on political spending, and another 45% disclosed some policies on their spending. So what that adds up to is about 3/4 of the companies in the S&P 500 do have policies of some sort on political spending. Now, about 1/3 disclose some or detailed information on or prohibit contributions to candidates, parties, committees, independent expenditures, and payments to trade associations, and also expenditures on ballot committees, on ballot measures. That was a significant surprise to us. We found that 30% disclosed some or detailed information on or placed prohibitions on payments to trade associations on the use of those payments for political purposes. Also, 18% disclose some or detailed information on or prohibit payments to 501c4 groups. So these numbers really are quite telling because it's a much broader universe. It's the S&P 500 as opposed to the S&P 200, where we have a much more granular benchmarking in the index. Now for 2013, the results of the index will be released in the fall. We have found that there's always been great interest of companies, on the part of companies, in those results. Matt asked the question, is political spending good for shareholders and companies? We see political spending as distorting markets and policy making and creating a skewed playing field. That's one of the reasons why we have been really pressing companies to disclose their political spending, to at least have it out there for shareholders, others, even for directors and management to know the full extent of the company's political spending. I think you can look at political spending and see the experience has been that it really can create problems for a well-functioning market economy. Go back to 1907 with the passage of the Tillman Act. That was the first federal legislation regulating political spending. That was enacted to curb the influence of the trusts. Another question that Matt posed was, is corporate political disclosure good or bad for shareholders and for companies? Our experience has been that there's no question that disclosure is good for companies and shareholders. It allows them to know what companies are spending directly and indirectly. We have found through our surveys that net directors do not necessarily know their company's political spending. We've also found in discussing with companies that political disclosure really has not had serious consequences. Has not led to pressure from shareholders and various stakeholders. It hasn't led to requests for more contributions. I think that we're at the point now where we're finding that standardized disclosure creates a level playing field, and that's something that we're finding more companies are saying to us that they want. They want standardized disclosure. They say, the level playing field for them is very important. The last point I want to cover is the proper place of regulation of political spending. I think when you're looking at the work that we've been doing on corporate political disclosure, we're not talking about regulation. We're talking about companies adopting policies that govern their political spending practices. I think this is very, very important. I think voluntary disclosure as a result of shareholder engagement has laid a strong foundation for broader disclosure and for a rule that the SEC is currently considering that would require companies to disclose the political spending with corporate funds. Should the SEC adopt the rule, then there would be a rulemaking proceeding where the details would be fleshed out, but that would be the logical next step. Let me just wrap up with two important takeaways. The first is that the steady growth of in the number of companies adopting disclosure and accountability is making it a corporate governance standard. We have a critical mass today. I think that's led to the rulemaking petition before the SEC for political disclosure. And secondly, it's in a company's self-interest to have robust disclosure and accountability policies. With the rise of the 501c4 groups, with the rise of trade associations engaging in political spending and doing it with anonymous funding, disclosure is very important for helping protect companies from risk, and it also leads to considered decision-making. So I appreciate being able to lay out these remarks and look forward to listening to Brian.
Do you agree?
Well, let me say, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's great to be back in front of this audience. I've spoken to it in years past, this group at least, back to when it had a different name. So it's good to be back. And, this could be an interesting discussion because it may appear that Bruce and I come from different planets. We couldn't diverge more in our views. There's little that he just said with which I agree. So it should be fun. However, I've been given only 7.5 minutes, very precise, for opening remarks. So I just have to set the scene as to what is really going on here from my perspective. And then we can get into the details of, is everybody actually doing it and so forth and so on. So I start from the premise that the government is large enough at all levels, local, regional, state, federal. It's pervasive enough, it's intrusive enough that the business community has really little choice but to engage with the government. Whether a business thrives or even sometimes whether it survives often depends on what the government does and doesn't do, and we all know that. So as a pragmatic matter, you have to engage with the government. The business community does. And we live in a republic, and that means that many of the key officials are elected. And that in turn implies that meaningful and effective engagement with the government also means engagement with the electoral process. And that's just how it works here in America. So the business community must participate in the political process if it has any hope of defending its interests or advancing its interests. And I don't really think that is debatable. The folks who view themselves as usually adverse to business, not always, but usually, the big labor federations, the trial lawyers, and others, you know who they are. And for short, this isn't the best possible phrase. I tried to think of something else, but it's the only thing I could come up with. I'll call them the anti-business community. They've got lots of money. They've got lots of manpower. They're very sophisticated. And they are very aggressive, as you all know, in their involvement in electoral politics. So the business community really can't afford to cede the field to them because if it does, it's just going to get rolled. And the anti-business community, and if I was a part of that, I would certainly be looking for the same opportunities, would prefer just that outcome. So how do you go about achieving it? And probably the emblematic example is the following. You want to find some way to negatively reinforce businesses who dare to participate. And that means you need to, what I call capital T, target them. And I refer, of course, many of you are familiar with this, some of you may not be, to the incident a few years ago in which Target, which is a Minnesota corporation, sought to improve the business climate in Minnesota. So in order to do that, it contributed to an organization called Minnesota Forward, and for some reason disclosed that contribution. And Minnesota Forward was an organization whose mission was to improve the business climate in Minnesota. And Minnesota Forward, in turn, in execution of that mission, supported a candidate for governor and contributed to that governor's campaign, a candidate whose central to his campaign, at least in part, was improving the business climate in Minnesota through, among other things, lowering the state tax on income and life. The anti-business community wanted to use this as an opportunity to send a message broadly as to what can happen to you if you participate in politics. And so they tried to figure out how can we negatively reinforce Target. And they came up with the following. Well, the candidate for governor, like the president at the time, but nonetheless, the candidate for governor did not support gay marriage. So let's gin up the gay rights activists and get them to do in-store protests, boycotts, create a lot of hullabaloo. That will be very uncomfortable for Target. And other companies seeing that will recognize that it may be dangerous, as Bruce likes to point out, if you engage in the political process through an organization like Minnesota Forward. Well, I think Target emerged unscathed. Undoubtedly, they had an episode that they had to manage that they would rather not have managed. And these incidents have been few and far between, so on a probability basis, your likelihood of having to face something like this isn't too great. Nonetheless, you're on notice. It's kind of nice business you have there. It would be a shame if anything should happen to it. So, what has that got to do with 14A8 proposals and calls for quote-unquote voluntary quote-unquote compliance? Well, it turns out under federal election law, and Bruce alluded to this, trade associations like the Trial Lawyers Association, they, as you know, have rebranded themselves as the American Association for Justice, but also the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and others, do not have to disclose their donors. So if you want a capital T target companies in order to dissuade them from entering the political process at all, it poses at least modest obstacle. And they would very much like to overcome that. So they are suggesting, and you remember, I think it was Lenin who said, the capitalist is the guy who will sell you the rope with which to hang him. So here they're suggesting not that they, that you buy that they buy the rope, but that you give it to them. Because they want the disclosure that will then enable them to at least threaten to capital T target you. And the ultimate goal here, and I've got some quotes if we want to get into it from leading organizations, is to remove the voice of business from the playing field. That strikes me as almost obviously not in the best interests of companies and therefore indirectly of their investors and stockholders, at least those who aren't conflicted with another agenda. So why would anybody do it? I don't think anybody really would, but the pitch, and you just heard it in spades at some length, is resistance is futile. And that's supposedly because of two things. First, all your peers are doing it, and then arguing in the alternative. Second, if they're not doing it now, they will be soon. This wave is unstoppable, and so you don't want to be an outlier, do you? That'll expose you even more. So why don't you get on board with the program? And that is very much the pitch. I think my 7.5 minutes is up, but I'm here to say that all your peers aren't doing it. This wave is not unstoppable, and it's not in the best interest of stockholders. And I think we then move to what happened in 2013.
Yes. So, right. So you're a corporate secretary, say, and you're trying to figure out what to do. What does the 2013 proxy season tell you about whether this is something that shareholders are demanding or not?
Yeah. So I've got one slide only for today, and I'm going to pop up and show it, and then I will come back. So I have to get up in order to do this. And I'm going to look not just at 2013, but at the last several years. And I need to explain this chart a bit because people contend the statistics. You know? So what it's showing is going back to 2006 and up to 2013 to date, and to date was probably last week or a week ago or something. There's still a few stragglers in this cycle, but very few. The average shareholder vote for the Fortune 250, and that's a numerical average, unweighted. So number 250 gets the same weight as number 1. And it's votes for all political spending or lobbying proposals that have been submitted under 1488. Bruce's organization is a leading source of content for those proposals, but he's not the only source of those proposals, and this graph shows them all. The data comes from the Manhattan Institute. They have something on their website. They have something called the Proxy Monitor, proxymonitor.org. They follow proxy season generally, not just this issue. And this data comes from them. And the blue area at the bottom represents the votes in favor of limiting lobbying or other political spending. The votes above is just 100% minus that. It's those that didn't vote in favor. The methodology for counting the votes is a matter of contention. The Manhattan Institute does it the way I suggest you would do. They go to the trouble of looking in all your proxy statements at that disclosure. I remember back when we first had to start doing this, about the effect of broker non-votes and abstentions, and determines based on your disclosure, what under state law and your charter documents, the effect of, for example, an abstention would be, and uses that result. So this is reporting it the way, under the law, the vote would be counted. Bruce, I think, and he may correct me if he wants.
Can we give Bruce a chance to...
Well, let me just explain.
Yeah.
This audience is really good at this.
Yeah.
Bruce uses, I believe, he looks to 1488 I-12. Okay, we forgot what's in 1488 I-12. That's the provision that says if you get the same proposal in the subsequent year and it didn't get more than a threshold amount, that you can exclude it. And 1488 I-12 itself, commission rule, says that you can exclude it if the vote.
No, excuse me, we don't use that.
You don't use that?
No, we don't.
Okay.
Please,
Cool.
go ahead.
Okay, I was told that you did. So
No.
if you don't, maybe you should explain where you come from. So I'll just tell you what the Manhattan is, because that keeps abstentions out. Basically, 1488 I-12 doesn't count abstentions, not because of the commission rule, because there's a slab where the staff says so. actually, I think he litigated that slap, which no one ever would. The staff would lose, but that's a whole separate issue. So when you look at this, first of all, you see that these proposals get clobbered every single year. I mean, this is very low levels. Only in proxy, counting 14A proposals, does anyone think that getting 20% or 30% even is a big victory. They almost never get a majority. And there's no trend. I mean, there was a little bulge. I'm not even sure it was statistically significant, but 2 or 3 years ago. But it's come back down again, and it doesn't look like 2013 is any different. I will say this, and Bruce should respond here. Bruce's proposals do better than average. Proposals based on Bruce's approach do better than average. The last couple of years, they've done about 6% better, as measured by the Manhattan Institute technique. In 2011, they did about 4% better, so they do a little better than average. Still, the overwhelming rejection by shareholders of these proposals is manifestly evident, at least I would point.
So you see this differently. You obviously look at it. You look at it. You're just looking at the for and against votes, right?
We look at the for and against votes.
What does that tell you then?
Well, the for and against votes, the experience for the for and against votes is that there has been a significant increase. If you go back and you look at for and against from 2004, the 2004 proxy season, when the CPA model resolution, which is really a very straightforward resolution. It just calls for companies to disclose political spending for board oversight for the adoption of policies. It does not get into lobbying. It does not tell companies not to engage in political spending. It's just, this is transparency and accountability. The average vote has risen from 9% in 2004 to over 30% in 2013, and for the last 4 proxy season, the average vote on the CPA model resolution using the SEC formula, the for and against, has been over 30%.
And has it been 2012 to 2013? Is it roughly flat, or is it?
No, it's it increased slightly from 2012 to 2013. Beginning back in 2011, through the past 4 years, it's been over 30%. There are many votes that come in over 40%. You have significant votes in the 30 to 40% range. In this past proxy season, it received 66% at one company, CF Industries, and that was with the board recommending against the resolution. I think one of the things, though, that I think is very important to understand is that companies take the votes seriously. We have found that where there has been a strong vote at a company in the preceding proxy season or last two preceding proxy season, the companies will, when the resolution is filed for the next year, companies will say, look, let's discuss this. This is a policy that I think, that we think we should adopt, and we have found that with companies now on a regular basis, where there's been a significant increase in a vote. Let's say, I think we had an interesting case in Boeing from 2011 to 2012. The vote jumped from 22 to 29% in 2013. Boeing, approached the shareholder, the investor who filed the resolution, and said, look, we believe we're adopting policies, and they negotiated a withdrawal. Our whole approach really is to have shareholder engagement really to be an opportunity to engage with a company. We're looking to have an agreement reached with a company where a company adopts disclosure and accountability policies. We prefer the resolution not to go to a vote. We've been very careful in keeping the resolution constant. There are other variants. That's why the votes, the chart here really does not capture what the real vote is on those, the resolution that seeks transparency and accountability. And we've been very, very careful about that.
If I could just jump in, keeping the abstentions out gives a very misleading view because some of the major mutual fund complexes I have had the opportunity to meet with their representatives and discuss this on some occasions, with some of them, abstain from these kinds of proposals almost always as a matter of policy. Privately, they would tell you they do not favor them, but for reasons that you can imagine, they find it more convenient to abstain than to vote in favor. Once again, from the Manhattan Institute Proxy Monitor Project, which is my source, their season-end report last year, their report isn't out for this year yet, reported that the 7 largest mutual fund families, I'm actually quoting here, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, Capital World Investors, Capital Research, Global Partners, and T. Rowe Price, supported only 3.6% of proposals calling for increased disclosure of corporate political spending. So, once again, the pitch, which I understand, that everyone is doing it, is not completely correct. Let me add something. I think it's a little bit technical, but for this audience, from the 2013, and it doesn't really go to this controversy so much, but it's, I think, of interest to you. There aren't very many ways to exclude the 14A8 proposals, but duplicative proposals is one way to do it. You should know that, so if you get 2, you get one for lobbying and one for corporate spending or something. The SEC staff has taken the position that if you get a lobbying one and you get a political spending one, you can exclude the later receipt because they are sufficiently identical in their subject matter. There was one, so that's interesting maybe if you get piled up with these. There was a situation this season where the proponents were very careful. The lobbying proposal said, and this has nothing to do with political spending. And the political spending proposal was very careful to say, and this has nothing to do with lobbying. And the SEC staff said, refused the no action request, saying that those were actually separate. So that is a sort of technical development that perhaps only this audience could appreciate, but I thought I might add.
Let me just add one thing, dealing with mutual funds. We do an annual survey of mutual fund voting on political disclosure. And, some of the larger mutual funds, the larger ones have been non-supportive, but non-supportive means that there are some that have moved from opposition to abstention. That was a very interesting development that we noted with Fidelity. But you do have a range of mutual funds that have been supporting the CPA model political disclosure resolution. By the way, we were very, very careful to limit it to political spending early on because of the SEC rule, or SEC's position that lobbying is an ordinary business activity, and that a resolution, deal with policy but not with ordinary business. And we have maintained that. We see company participation in the political process as something that they do have a right to engage in. We've never argued against it. And I think some of the folks in the audience with whom we have worked closely, the company folks, we've had that discussion. There's agreement on that. It's just, the point that we have made to companies, when you engage politically, you engage. It's best to engage transparently. And I think that is a very important point to understand. And it's the approach that we have taken consistently from the 2004 proxy season, when the effort to achieve transparency and accountability was begun.
And I would say it's very often useful for many purposes, not just this, but to act through trade associations that represent your sector of the economy. And trade associations offer many advantages. They have the scope and scale to be smart and efficient at what they're doing. There is some safety in numbers, if you will, and they overcome the free rider effects. If I stick my neck up and I'm successful and I've taken all the heat, but the entire sector gets the benefit, then the economists will tell you that there will be underinvestment in that effort. So the trade associations are a very effective form. They know what they're doing. They're often very savvy. And and I make this point, the Trial Lawyers Association doesn't have to disclose their donors, neither does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or pick your favorite trade association. Trade associations make their own independent judgments. They do so on behalf of the business community, and the goal really is to keep business out of this arena. And I don't know, let me just, I can't go through this whole period without quoting. There was a 3-year sort of business plan for an organization some of you might be familiar with. It's one of the parts of Media Matters. Media Matters 2012, a 3-year campaign. I'm not sure they meant it to be public, but it got out on the internet somehow. And they have, as one of the elements of their campaign, this particular topic. And I'll just give you a very few, I've got lots of them, but I'll just give you a very few to give you a little flavor of it. Quote, working with partner organizations, we will make the case that a corporation's political efforts have the potential to irreparably damage its brand and bottom line, unquote. We're going to capital T target them. And if they get that message, then they will withdraw and leave it to the labor organizations and the like.
So I've heard two very different things about risk. And so I want to ask what the implications are for a corporate secretary. And specifically, let's assume that you're a company that agrees with you that participation in trade association is a good thing. Let's say, so I hear one person saying that the proposals here really would exacerbate your risk because you'd be disclosing your trade associations and that and that would be used against you. And then I've heard on Bruce's perspective is that no, it's a way of managing risk. So two questions. One is, what's the right way to look at it? And two, don't the results in the proxy season to date tell you that if you concluded that it was better risk management to have a good internal process but not disclosed publicly, that the shareholders will allow that? At least even in Bruce's view of the world, at least 70% of shareholders would say that's okay. So the question, risk, is it risk avoidance or risk management, and what should a corporate secretary do?
I very much agree with that, and once again, talk to institutional investors about what their views are on this issue, and I think I was going to say universal, but we're always worried about that, but it's sort of very broad consensus, and maybe universal view was that, like all things at a company that matter, this is something that ought to be managed effectively. There ought to be some level of board oversight. Probably not, the board shouldn't be managing it and making decisions, but it should be aware of it and have an eye on it. And that there probably should be some kind of a policy that describes how we do this and how we make our decisions. When it's the company itself, although trade association dues and the like are, may be pretty easy under such a policy. And if a company's doing that, we're fine. If they're not paying any attention, they have no idea, that maybe that's not so good, but if they're paying attention, they're fine. Much of the disclosure, and Bruce will probably hotly contest this, but I will say it anyway, much of the people who've signed up, when you look closely at what they've signed up to, as part of the program, gets you to believe that everybody's doing it and it's the way for the future and it's unstoppable. Much of it is agreeing to disclose what already is required to be disclosed by law. And there's a very, you can see he's already getting excited.
Yeah, so let's let Bruce.
No, again, I like to fundamentally disagree with that. And respectfully disagree too.
Me too.
The disclosure that is asked for in the CPA model resolution is for spending that is not disclosed. Trade association payments are not required to be disclosed. Payments to C4s are not required to be disclosed. And I think companies are disclosing their spending at the state level, using corporate funds to be able to provide a full picture of the company's political spending, and I think that's very important. I think that the disclosure is very important for achieving accountability for companies in their relationship with trade associations. Over the years, in my past life, I had also done quite a bit of consulting with some of the major trade associations, so I have an understanding of how they work internally, how decisions are made in terms of policy positions. I think that there are instances, and I think there are instances, for instance, on an issue such as climate change, where you have companies that have very supportive of addressing climate change, that are members of associations that have been leading opposition to climate change. And a company's money is being used, in that case, in direct conflict with a company policy, and that has business implications. I think very important to understand. It's not just reputation, but it gets to bottom line. For instance, if a company has adopted internal policies or practices in terms of capping emissions, they're looking at emissions trading as a source of revenue. They're members of an association or members of an association that is opposed to action on climate change. That can really have a major effect on the company. We've had discussions with companies about this issue, where they do find themselves in conflict with the association on major issues, and yet the company is paying its dues, and some portion of those dues are going to be used for political purposes. That will be supporting positions that will conflict with the company, and so we have said to companies, having disclosure of those payments is very important for shareholders to be able to assess, where there is conflict, and it really gets to managing the risk that is related to that. And also, we found, that through surveys and other instances where directors do not necessarily know, what a company's political spending are, what its payments are. This brings that type of information to the attention of directors. So I think, it really helps the company.
But you need disclosure to do that, right?
Pardon?
You don't need disclosure, public disclosure.
For shareholders, you do need public disclosure.
Not to bring it to the directors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, but the fact is, but it allows shareholders to then hold directors accountable for the type of policies.
So Bruce is here just to help you manage your relationship with your trade associations, just in case they're off the reservation and doing damage to the sector that they represent. With respect, I find that an unlikely set of motivations, and I also think that the company internally, as it manages many different areas, its property portfolio, all kinds of stuff, is capable of managing that kind of relationship without potentially damaging, because there are people out there, as we know, whose goal is to use this disclosure to attempt to diminish your brand equity. They also find that the trade associations are among the most effective in advancing the perspective of the business community, and impeding their funding would be very helpful. So I am not going to buy quite yet the notion that we're just here to help.
So let's talk a little bit about what to expect going forward. There's been a rulemaking petition from SEC and certainly pressure on both sides. What do we think that the SEC and courts and legislatures are likely to do in the next year? And also, what should we expect from the proxy season next year?
Yeah, well,
Bruce, do you want to take it first? Or?
I think, this is a very interesting question. We've been focusing just on corporate governance and on shareholder activity. But when you look at what's happening at the state level, there's quite a bit of ferment there. You've had disclosure laws that have been passed in Iowa and Maryland. You've had strong bipartisan support for disclosure legislation in Texas and Montana. In Texas, the legislature passed a very strong disclosure bill that was vetoed by the governor. Montana, it died, I think, in the legislature, but there was very strong bipartisan support. And I think, these are the things that are very interesting. At the state, in New York State, you've had regulations that have been issued by the Attorney General requiring C4 disclosure. California is getting very active in this area, so there's quite a bit of ferment there. I think when you look at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the rulemaking, this is a very interesting situation there. At a May House hearing, it was a hearing before Financial Services, Mary Jo White was given every opportunity to be able to say that she was not going to proceed with the rulemaking petition that had been submitted by the Committee of Law Professors, and she declined the invitations to do so. So I think at the Securities and Exchange Commission, we don't know what she's going to do, but I think there is a significant chance.
Well, on that front,
there
there was a very
action.
big development this past week. What had happened in the waning hours of the Mary Shapiro chairmanship was, and this gets kind of geeky Washington stuff, there's something called the Reg Flex agenda, which is submitted to OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. What a wonderful bureaucratic title, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And it's done semi-annually. And the agencies have to say what's on their rulemaking calendar. And there's no enforcement mechanism, but they do that. And as Mary Shapiro was going out the door, she put this item on in the sort of working towards a proposal category. Last week, in the next submission, this rulemaking possibility turned up in the Reg Flex agenda under the long-term action category. So it has been very substantially demoted. And I will say that, and I obviously wasn't, but if I were advising Mary Jo White and she had decided this was not something she was interested in, I would tell her to put it in the long-term action category rather than take it off the Reg Flex agenda altogether, because you're just going to take a whole bunch of arrows you don't need to take if you do that. So I would say, at least for the near term, this has been very substantially downgraded as the source of any likely SEC action. And of course, this late in the year, plainly nothing could impact the 2014 proxy season.
So, but how about on the judicial front? There was Qualcomm got sued over the last year, and there was a suit to, as I understand it, under Delaware law to compel the disclosure of corporate records under the section of Delaware law to do that. And Qualcomm, I believe, settled and effectively gave the proponent what they were looking for. Is this something that you see happening in the future? Is it something you support? Bruce.
Well, we've not taken a position on that, but clearly what was very interesting in that case is that Qualcomm went ahead and settled, and I think of interest when it reached up to Irwin Jacobs, the chairman of Qualcomm, and he learned about the suit. He said, "I want it settled. I want the company to adopt disclosure," and the company used as the model for the disclosure the indicators in the CPA-Zicklin index. He said, "I want the company to be in the top 10," and so the company's policies that were adopted placed it, at least informally, within the top 10 companies in benchmarking for the index. Filing suits, that's on a case-by-case basis.
So, with respect to the legal merits of the suit, I think most Delaware practitioners would tell you that they're highly unlikely to succeed because under Delaware 220, it's not enough to say there's some generic general problem. You have to have something, they've used a little different language, but it's kind of like probable cause, that there's something specific at the company that's an issue that is worthy of looking into it. And unless they carved out a special rule for political spending, I think these suits would fail. It is true that companies, when they are under the bright spotlight of publicity, I have no insight into the internal decision-making in Qualcomm, but they sometimes decide to agree. And I'm not sure how much Qualcomm actually agreed to also. Once again, these agreements are often less than they appear to be. And this is going to be a moving, this is going to be I predict that the goalpost here will continue to move. Because if you look at it from, if I were running the CPA index, I want to try to do two things, and they're a little contradictory. I want to persuade everyone that everyone's doing it, we better get on the bandwagon and so forth. And I want to get to an end point where basically companies are not involved in politics as much as they used to be, and their trade associations are, and you'll deny that, so that's okay. But in order to do that, I've got to start out with a set of standards that are relatively loose so that I get decent numbers of people signing up. And then as the years go by, I want to turn the ratchet so that
is that
harder.
Accurate description of how it works, or no?
They changed them from 2011 to 2012.
Wait, the CPA-Zicklin Index has been refined, but it has not been changed. We have worked closely with companies. We receive comments from companies. We take them seriously. Those have been reflected in tweaking of the index, but not changing the indicators. The indicators have been reduced from 29 to 25, and this again is based on discussions with companies. We have a scoring advisory committee that's independent, that has leading experts on indexes who we consult. The index is fully transparent. Any changes are indicated, in the before the index is sent out to companies. They'll receive about a year's notice on that. One of the things that is very interesting are the number of companies that have stated publicly, and I think this recently occurred on a conference board webcast where one of the assistant general counsels at Altria said, we take the index very seriously. It has been very helpful for us. We have heard that from countless other companies. We have heard that from corporate governance lawyers at some of the leading law firms. That could be at Skadden Arps, it could be at Covington and Burling, it could be at others where, they say they see this as a very important tool. So, the index has been, we have made sure that it is methodologically sound, it is fully transparent, because we wanted to accurately reflect what companies are doing and to have it serve as a serious benchmarking tool, which it does. So I think the index really has established itself, and we're very pleased with that, because it really provides us with a very accurate snapshot each year of what company policies and practices are on disclosure and accountability.
Let's see if people have questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I'll try to make this sound as nonpartisan as possible. Brian, what I heard Bruce say was that he's not necessarily trying to get corporations completely out of the political process, but maybe one of the salutary effects of disclosure is to mitigate the degree. So my question to you is, how much is too much money in the system? Is there any number of dollars, whether it's from labor or the trial lawyers or corporations, where we should just start to feel queasy about it?
Yeah, so yes. A couple of things on that. Just by way of introduction, we all have our own personal perspectives. I think when we're acting as fiduciaries, we obviously have to keep the best interests of our organization at heart, and we have to put our own perspectives to one side. So asking the question, what's in the best interest of the company, and therefore indirectly of its stockholders, is really the question that we have to ask when we're acting as fiduciaries or advisors to fiduciaries. And so sometimes there will be a difference there. Many people are concerned about the effect of money in politics, and that's a legitimate and serious concern. I would say, from my perspective, that the way those concerns have to be dealt with is in an even-handed, neutral fashion. The Federal Election Commission has 2 members from each party for a reason. The disclosure regime that has been enacted is, and I'm sure partisans will find things that they don't like on either side, but basically in a way that's even-handed. And one of the things that I personally, and now I'm going to talk personally rather than as an advisor to fiduciaries, find problematic about this approach is it's focused entirely only on the business community, and the results would impact only the business community. And the American Association for Justice, the old American Trial Lawyers Association, gets a free pass. So that doesn't seem like the right way. If you're interested in the problem of money in politics, we need to address that in ways that are even-handed, not. And the name of the organization is the Center for Political Accountability, but when you look at the right on the homepage, it says corporate. So it's really only corporate political accountability, and we know that unions and others, trial lawyers, have huge sums, and that's not being addressed. So, and if you look at the background of the people involved, I mean, you can see why. Let me say no more.
Other questions? Oh, in the back.
Yeah, I have a question for Bruce. Bruce, I talked about this over here. BlackRock,
Yeah.
investors, and I wonder, I still don't have a good answer in my head, or clear thinking about it in my head, of why this issue should be something that investors are voting on. So in other words, there are lots and lots of things that companies could disclose that they don't disclose, right? And so, for example, should they build a new factory in China or in India or in Arkansas, or should they downsize their workforce, or should they go into a new line of business, or should they contemplate spinning off a division? There's lots and lots of things you can think about that companies might disclose to investors that have really significant impacts on the business, that have really significant impacts on the bottom line and the financials of the company. And I just wonder, why is this issue more important than all of those issues?
So how does this differ from other things that we say, not material or not for shareholders to know about or vote on, like charitable contributions or other business?
Well, I think you go back to the Citizens United decision, and it's a very interesting decision there, because there was one section of the decision that dealt with disclosure, where the court held by 8-1. It was an 8-1 vote. It was a very strong opinion written by Justice Kennedy, that was a ringing endorsement of disclosure, and they talked about the importance of disclosure of company political spending, for shareholder democracy, for corporate democracy. And I think that it's very, very important to really understand on why this area of disclosure is so central. That when companies are engaging in the political process, where there is, I think, a broader range of risk in several areas, that this type of transparency is very important for the integrity of the company, and it's something that is of significant interest to shareholders.
I mean, I don't disagree that it's something that you would want regulation about, right? I mean, I think I totally agree with Brian about his view about the benefits or the drawbacks of the SEC taking this up or other people taking it up. I mean, I think regulation makes a lot of sense. I just don't understand why this is more important, or frankly even as important as lots of other things that can be disclosed. should shareholders vote on everything? Should we, when you talk about corporate democracy, what kind of corporate democracy do you have in mind in the sense of shareholders voting?
Our focus has been on political spending. I mean, we haven't focused on those broader issues, but this is the issue that we focused on. It's clearly one where companies are responding, and when you do look at votes, votes getting into the 30 to 40% range are significant votes, and they are an indicator of strong shareholder interest and concern.
And I guess I would turn that around and say, in terms of opinion and Citizens United, yes, shareholders ultimately do and can and should control what their company does. And in this instance, shareholders have spoken again and again and again by overwhelming margins that in any other context would be considered being totally clobbered, that they don't want this because they understand, those who are sophisticated, that this is not in their best interests.
So we're about out of time, but I'm going to ask each of you to do one sentence or two sentences at most.
I've never spoken it just.
No semicolons or like that. What should our audience take away? What are the most important thing?
I would say that it's in the company's self-interest, protects the company, and it's a mainstream corporate practice. Those are the important takeaways from our discussion this morning and from the experience that we've had in addressing this issue and working with companies.
And I would say,
Well done.
okay, I will try to match that. I would say that it's manifestly not in the best interest of the company and therefore its shareholders, and that shareholders routinely and repeatedly so vote, that everyone is not doing it, and that it's not a wave that's unstoppable. But it does make sense for the board to have some monitoring supervision of this. It does make sense to have internal policies that guide the activity in this area, as in many others, and that's what one ought to do.
Great. Well, I want to thank you very much. There's also online, there's some really good pieces that go into this. There's on one side, there's a great series of posts on the Harvard Law Corporate Governance blog by Babchuck and Jackson that try to address a lot of the arguments against mandatory disclosure. Obviously, they're in favor of SEC rules in this area, and whether you agree with it or not, they're thoughtful. And then on the other side, there's some pieces by Paul Atkins on whether that this is material, on Brad Smith on whether the SEC is the right agency to be involved in. So I think some good things that are well worth.
You also get the CPA.
And the CPA, this
articles in the conference board review.
Yeah. So you get to go look at that. So I want to thank the panelists. This was very, very interesting.